The desert wind carried whispers of forgotten names as Chenoa opened her eyes to an endless sky painted in shades of amber and rose. Her body ached against the hard earth, surrounded by 7 weathered stones that formed a perfect circle. Each stone was taller than a man, carved with symbols that seemed to shimmer in the morning light. Spirals that spoke of journeys, handprints that promised return, and creatures that belonged to dreams older than memory. The morning sun cast long shadows through the Chihuahuan Desert, where ancient saguaro cacti stood like silent sentinels watching over secrets buried in time. The air smelled of sage and something else, something that reminded her of her grandmother's lodge, where she had pressed her face to the hide window every morning, searching for visions that danced beyond the mountains. She shouldn't be here. The last thing she remembered was walking away from the mission school, fleeing another day of forced prayers in a language that felt like stones in her mouth, another lesson about forgetting who she was meant to be. The priest had been kind enough, but his kindness came with conditions. Speak only English, wear only their clothes, pray only to their God. You must become civilized, he had said, and something inside her had recoiled like a wild horse feeling the rope. Her medicine bundle was still clutched in her hands, hidden beneath the rough wool dress they made her wear. The leather pouch felt warm with the sacred objects inside. A piece of turquoise her grandmother had given her, eagle feathers blessed by the medicine man, corn pollen for prayers she was forbidden to speak. Daughter, you have returned home. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, carried on the wind like pollen from ancient flowers. Chenoa's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the cadence, the gentle authority that had once taught her the songs of healing when she was small enough to sit in the circle of grandmothers. But the soldiers had taken her away when she was 7 winters old, and that had been 8 long seasons ago. Rising slowly, Chenoa dusted red earth from her dress and looked around. The landscape felt familiar yet foreign, like a half-remembered dream or a song heard in another life. In the distance, the sacred mountains stood purple against the dawn, their peaks touching clouds that seemed to hold the weight of generations. She had seen these mountains in her dreams every night at the school, when homesickness carved holes in her chest. Her feet knew the way, and that both terrified and comforted her more than being lost. She walked toward a cluster of traditional Apache dwellings that appeared like blessings, their wickiups covered with hide and brush, shaped by hands that understood the language of earth and sky. Smoke rose from cooking fires, carrying the scent of roasting pine nuts and drying meat. As she approached, she saw faces at doorways, weathered, knowing faces that watched her with neither surprise nor judgment. An elderly man sat weaving a burden basket beneath a ramada, his hands moving with the precision of someone who had been doing this work since before the white men came. Children played between the dwellings, their laughter carrying on the morning air like the songs she remembered. They looked up as she passed, their dark eyes holding the light of those who still knew the old stories, and Chenoa felt a recognition so deep it made her stumble. One little girl, no more than 6 winters, held a doll made of corn husks, and when she smiled, Chenoa found herself weeping for reasons that went deeper than words. "Grandfather," she whispered in Apache, though she had been forbidden to speak it for 8 seasons. The basket weaver looked up, and his eyes held the deep brown of river stones worn smooth by sacred waters. His face was a map of the desert, lined with arroyos and mesas, weathered by sun and wind into something beautiful and enduring. When he smiled, Chenoa felt something crack open inside her chest, like a seed that had been buried too long, finally feeling rain. "We have been waiting," he said in the old language, setting down his weaving. "The circle called, and you answered." Chenoa's legs gave out, and she sank onto a woven mat beside the old man. Around his workspace lay materials that spoke of the old ways, willow shoots for baskets, sinew for binding, plant dyes that painted the world in colors the mission school had tried to make her forget. "I don't understand," she whispered in Apache, the words feeling strange on her tongue after so many seasons of silence. "I don't know how I got here. I don't even know if this place still exists." The old man's hands resumed their work, weaving willow into patterns that told stories. "Understanding is not always the first step," he said. "Sometimes we must walk the path before we can see where it leads." Chenoa watched his hands move, mesmerized by the sureness of his touch. "The priests, they'll come looking for me. They said I belong to the mission now. They said my family—" "Your family lives," he interrupted gently. "Not all were taken. Not all were lost." "My name is Chenoa," she said, though at the school they had called her Sarah and beaten her when she spoke her real name. "I know," the old man replied. "I am Naal Nish. I have been waiting for you since the day they took you, when your grandmother came to me with tears and prayers." Chenoa's heart hammered against her ribs. "My grandmother lives?" Nalnish set down his weaving and looked at her with eyes that held the weight of mountains. "She has been singing you home every dawn, every sunset. The circle remembers all who belong to it." A woman appeared from one of the wickiups, her long black hair braided with shells and silver, dressed in the traditional camp dress decorated with elk teeth and turquoise. She moved with the careful grace of someone who carried sacred knowledge in her bones. "My daughter," she said in Apache, and Chenoa felt her heart stop. It was the voice from the wind, the voice that had called her home. "Grandmother?" Chenoa whispered. The woman knelt beside her, and Chenoa could see in her face the same woman who had sung her to sleep, who had taught her to gather medicine plants, who had wept when the soldiers came. But she was older now, her face marked by 8 seasons of grief and hope. "I am here," her grandmother said, gathering Chenoa into arms that smelled of sage and sweet grass. "I have been waiting." They held each other as the sun climbed higher, and Chenoa felt 8 seasons of loneliness melting away. Around them, the camp continued its ancient rhythms, women grinding corn and acorns, men working with tools of bone and stone, children learning the skills their ancestors had passed down through countless generations. "This is where you were born," her grandmother said, leading her through the camp. "Where your mother drew her first breath, where your great-grandmother learned the songs of healing." Chenoa placed her palm against the earth, and for a moment she could swear she felt the heartbeat of generations beneath her hand. "I thought I had forgotten everything. At the school they said our ways were dying." Her grandmother's eyes held the depth of sacred springs. "The Apache way does not die. It sleeps, waiting for the right season to bloom again. You carry it in your blood, in your dreams, in the songs that call to you when you think no one is listening." They walked to where other women sat preparing traditional foods, grinding corn on metates that had been passed down through generations. The sound of stone against stone created a rhythm that matched the beating of Chenoa's heart, a music she had dreamed of during the long nights at the mission. "Your hands remember," her grandmother said, guiding Chenoa to kneel beside the grinding stone. "Even when the mind forgets, the body holds the knowledge of our mothers." As Chenoa's hands found the familiar motion, tears fell onto the cornmeal, and the other women began to sing softly in Apache. Songs of welcome, songs of healing, songs that spoke of daughters coming home. Each note was a thread weaving her back into the fabric of her people. An old woman approached, her face lined with the wisdom of many winters. She carried a water basket so perfectly woven that not a drop escaped its walls. "This is Desba," her grandmother said. "She was your mother's closest friend before the sickness took her." Desba studied Chenoa's face with eyes that saw beyond the mission dress and shortened hair. "You have your mother's spirit," she said in Apache. "She would be proud to see you return to us." Chenoa's throat tightened. "I barely remember her face." "Then we will help you remember," Desba replied, setting down her basket. "Through stories, through songs, through the work of her hands that she passed to you." As the day wore on, Chenoa found herself surrounded by relatives she had thought lost forever. A young man named Ki, her cousin, who taught children to make bows and arrows from mulberry wood. An aunt named Nasha, who knew the healing properties of every plant that grew in the desert. Uncle Tahoma, who could read the tracks of animals and the signs of weather in the clouds. Each face was a piece of herself she had lost, now slowly being returned. They spoke to her in Apache, patiently waiting when she struggled for words, gently correcting her pronunciation when 8 seasons of English had stiffened her tongue. "At the school," Chenoa said as evening painted the sky in shades of fire, "they told us that speaking Apache would condemn our souls, that our ceremonies were devil worship." Her grandmother's hands stilled on the hide she was softening. "And what does your heart tell you?" Chenoa looked around the camp, at children playing games that taught them to hunt and gather, at men carving sacred objects while sharing stories of their ancestors, at women weaving patterns that held the history of their people. She felt the weight of her medicine bundle against her chest, still hidden beneath the mission dress. "My heart tells me this is holy," she whispered. "Then trust your heart," her grandmother said. "It has been calling you home longer than your mind has been fighting the call." The next morning, Chenoa woke before dawn in her grandmother's wickiup, wrapped in soft deerskin and surrounded by the scent of sage that clung to everything in the camp. For a moment, she forgot where she was, expecting to hear the harsh bell that summoned the children to morning prayers at the mission. Instead, she heard the gentle sounds of a people waking with the sun, the soft murmur of morning prayers, the crackling of fires being rekindled, the distant song of a mockingbird greeting the day. Her grandmother was already awake, sitting cross-legged near the fire, her hands moving in the ancient gestures of the sunrise prayer. She spoke in Apache, her voice carrying words of gratitude to the 4 directions, to the earth that sustained them, to the sky that blessed them with light. "Come," she said when the prayer was finished. "Today you learn to be Apache again." They began with the simplest things: how to braid her hair in the traditional way, how to wrap herself in the woven blanket that marked her as one of the people, how to walk with the quiet step that disturbed no more of the earth than necessary. Each lesson was both new and familiar, like remembering a song she had hummed as a child. "The mission taught you to be ashamed of these things," her grandmother said as she helped Chenoa into a traditional dress made of soft buckskin, decorated with shells and small silver ornaments. "But there is no shame in being who you were born to be." Chenoa caught her reflection in a bowl of water and barely recognized herself. Gone was the girl in the rough wool dress, hair cropped short in the mission style. In her place stood a young Apache woman, her long hair flowing freely, her dress speaking of generations of skill and beauty. Desba appeared at the entrance to the wickiup, carrying a burden basket filled with wild plants. "Today you remember the medicine," she said. "Come." They walked into the desert, where the morning light revealed a world that had seemed empty to Chenoa's mission-trained eyes. But under Desba's guidance, she began to see the abundance that had always been there: the osha root that eased breathing troubles, the chaparral that fought infection, the desert willow that soothed pain. "Each plant has its own spirit," Desba explained as they knelt beside a cluster of purple flowers. "You must ask permission before you take, offer thanks after you gather, use only what you need." Chenoa's hands remembered more than her mind as she touched each plant. At the mission, such knowledge had been called superstition, but here in the desert, surrounded by the wisdom of her ancestors, it felt like the most practical truth in the world. At the school, Chenoa said as they gathered prickly pear pads for healing poultices, they gave us medicines from bottles, pills that made us sick. They said our plant medicines were useless. Desba's laugh was like water over stones. And yet here we are, healthy and strong, while they get sicker from their own remedies. Sometimes the old ways persist because they work, child. In the afternoon, Nalnish taught her to weave baskets, her fingers slowly remembering the tension and rhythm that created vessels both beautiful and useful. The willow shoots had to be harvested at the right time, soaked until they were pliable, then woven in patterns that told stories. This design, he said, pointing to a complex geometric pattern, tells of the journey from the underworld to this world. And this one speaks of the 4 sacred directions. When you weave, you are not just making a basket. You are telling the story of our people. Chenoa's first attempts were clumsy, her baskets lopsided and loose. But Naalnish was patient, his weathered hands guiding hers until the muscle memory began to return. Each basket was a prayer, each weave a connection to the women who had taught this skill to their daughters for countless generations. I feel like I'm trying to learn everything at once, Chenoa said, as her third attempt at a water basket fell apart in her hands. You are not learning, Nalnish corrected gently. You are remembering. There is a difference. Learning comes from outside. Remembering comes from within. As evening approached, the camp gathered for the evening meal. Chenoa watched in wonder as food was prepared using methods unchanged for centuries. Corn ground on metates, meat roasted over oak coals, wild plants prepared in ways that maximized their nutrition and medicine. She sat in the circle with her family, speaking Apache with increasing fluency, laughing at stories that connected her to ancestors she had never known but somehow remembered. For the first time in 8 years, she felt the deep contentment that came from being exactly where she belonged. But as the fire burned low and people began to drift to their wickiups, Chenoa felt a familiar fear creeping in. Tomorrow the soldiers might come. Tomorrow the priests might demand her return. Tomorrow this fragile happiness might be shattered like morning frost in the desert sun. Her grandmother seemed to read her thoughts. Fear is the last chain they put on you, she said softly, and it is the hardest one to break. 3 days passed like a dream woven from memory and hope, each sunrise bringing Chenoa deeper into the rhythms of her people. She learned to identify medicinal plants by their scent alone, to weave grass into patterns that held both beauty and meaning, to speak Apache with the fluency that had once earned her beatings at the mission school. But on the 4th evening, as thunderclouds gathered over the sacred mountains like dark promises, a lone rider appeared on the horizon. Chenoa was helping her grandmother prepare yucca root for soap when the lookout's call echoed through the camp. Her blood turned to ice water as she recognized the blue uniform of the cavalry, the rigid posture of authority that brooked no argument. Sergeant Morrison, her grandmother said quietly, and Chenoa heard a lifetime of dealing with unwelcome visitors in those 2 words. The sergeant rode into camp with the casual arrogance of a man who believed the entire world belonged to him. His eyes swept over the wickiups with barely concealed disgust, lingering on the traditional dress and customs, as if they were personal affronts to his vision of civilization. I'm looking for a runaway from the mission school, he announced in English, his voice carrying across the camp. Girl named Sarah Martinez, about 15 years old. Father Gabriel sent word she's been missing for 4 days. Chenoa's heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed herself deeper into the shadows of the wickiup. Around the camp, people continued their evening tasks with studied indifference, but she could feel their awareness like a held breath. Many children pass through our camp, Nalnish replied in careful English, his basket weaving never stopping. Travelers, traders, Relatives visiting from other bands. Perhaps you could describe this, Sarah. Sergeant Morrison dismounted, his boots making harsh sounds against the soft earth. Don't play games with me, old man. Short brown hair, about this tall, wearing a mission dress. The priests say she's been corrupted by Apache superstitions. Needs to be brought back for proper Christian education. Genoa's grandmother placed a gentle hand on her arm, a touch that said, "Be still, be silent, trust." But Genoa could see the sergeant's eyes scanning the camp, taking note of every face, every movement. Corruption, Desba said, her voice carrying the edge of flint, is a strange word for a child learning the ways of her own people. These aren't her people, Morrison snapped. She's a ward of the mission now, property of the United States government. And I'll search every wiki up if I have to. Thunder rolled across the mountains, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Lightning split the darkening sky, illuminating the camp in brief, brilliant moments that made everything seem both more real and more dreamlike. You are welcome to search, Nalnish said, setting down his weaving at last. But the storm comes, and the desert is no place to be caught in the rain. Perhaps you would accept our hospitality until morning. It was a masterstroke of Apache diplomacy, offering help while making it impossible for the sergeant to refuse without appearing both ungrateful and foolish. Morrison's face reddened, but the increasing intensity of the rain left him little choice. "One night," he growled, "but I'm searching this camp at first light." As the storm unleashed its full fury, Genoa found herself hiding in her grandmother's wickiup, listening to rain drum against the hide covering like the fingers of spirits demanding entry. Outside, she could hear the sergeant accepting grudging shelter in Nalnish's lodge, his harsh voice complaining about primitive accommodations and savage customs. "He will find me tomorrow," Genoa whispered in Apache, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Perhaps," her grandmother replied, braiding Chenoa's hair with hands that remained steady despite the circumstances. "Or perhaps the storm brings other possibilities." "I can't go back," Chenoa said, and the words carried 8 years of accumulated pain. "I can't pretend to be Sarah again. I can't forget everything I've remembered." Her grandmother's hands paused in their work. "Then we must ensure you don't have to." Outside, lightning painted the world in stark black and white, and thunder spoke in the voice of the ancestors. Genoa pressed her medicine bundle to her chest and prayed to spirits the mission had tried to teach her to deny, asking for strength, for wisdom, for the courage to face whatever tomorrow might bring. The storm raged through the night, and with it came dreams. Visions of children taken from their families, of languages forbidden and ceremonies suppressed, of a people struggling to hold onto their souls in the face of forces that would reshape them into something foreign and empty. But the dreams also showed her other things. Hidden places in the mountains where the old ways survived, secret gatherings where the forbidden songs were still sung, networks of relatives and allies who had spent generations protecting their own from those who would destroy them. When dawn broke clear and bright after the storm, Chenoa knew that whatever happened next, she was no longer the frightened girl who had awakened in the circle of stones. She was Apache, daughter of the desert, keeper of ancient wisdom, and no force on earth could take that away from her again. The morning after the storm dawned crisp and clean, the desert washed bright by the night's rain. Chenoa woke to find her grandmother already gone, along with most of the adults in the camp. Only the children and a few elders remained, going about their morning tasks with an air of studied normalcy that felt like a held breath. Sergeant Morrison emerged from Nalnish's wickiup looking rumpled and irritated, his uniform bearing the evidence of a night spent on Apache bedding rather than a proper military cot. He surveyed the camp with suspicious eyes, clearly aware that something had changed during the night, but unable to put his finger on what. "Where is everyone?" he demanded of Key, who was teaching a group of children to fletch arrows with turkey feathers. "Hunting," Key replied without looking up from his work. "The storm yesterday scattered the deer. The hunters left before dawn to track them." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, and Morrison had no choice but to accept it. But Chenoa, watching from the shadows of her grandmother's wickiup, could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand rested near his sidearm. "I'll search the camp now," he announced. For the next hour, Chenoa pressed herself against the back wall of the wickiup, her heart hammering as the sergeant methodically searched each dwelling. She could hear his boots on the hard-packed earth, his gruff voice questioning the remaining elders, the increasing frustration in his tone as he found no trace of the runaway he sought. When he finally approached her grandmother's wickiup, Chenoa closed her eyes and pressed her medicine bundle to her chest, whispering prayers in Apache that she had thought forgotten. The hide covering rustled as Morrison pushed it aside, and she heard his boots step onto the woven mats that covered the floor. "Empty," he muttered after a moment that felt like hours. "Damn savages and their hide-and-seek games." After he left, Chenoa remained motionless for a long time, afraid that movement would somehow call him back. Only when she heard his horse galloping away from the camp did she dare to breathe normally again. Slowly, she pushed aside a carefully arranged pile of blankets and baskets that had concealed her hiding place. The wickiup appeared empty from the entrance, but in the traditional way, her people had created a space within a space, a pocket of invisibility that could shelter those who needed protection. One by one, the adults began to return to camp, appearing from directions that suggested they had spent the morning at perfectly innocent tasks. But their eyes held the satisfaction of people who had successfully protected their own, and Chenoa understood that this had been planned from the moment the sergeant's horse appeared on the horizon. "He will be back," Nalnish said as the camp gathered for the midday meal. "With more soldiers, more threats. The government does not like to lose property it considers its own." Chenoa's grandmother nodded gravely. "Which is why we must make a choice. All of us." She turned to face Chenoa, her eyes holding depths of love and sorrow that made Chenoa's chest tighten. "You cannot stay here, child. Not safely. But there are other places, other people who remember the old ways." "The hidden camps," Desba said quietly. "In the deep mountains, where the cavalry cannot follow." Chenoa felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You want me to leave again? I just found you. I just remembered who I am." "We want you to survive," her grandmother replied. "We want you to carry what you have learned to places where it can take root and grow. There are others like you. Children taken from their families, young people struggling to remember what was stolen from them. They need teachers, guides, bridges between the world they were forced into and the world they came from." Nalnish set down his work and looked at Chenoa with eyes that held the weight of difficult wisdom. "There is a choice before you, child. You can try to remain hidden here, always looking over your shoulder, always afraid. Or you can become something more, a keeper of the old knowledge, a teacher for the lost ones, a guardian of what must not be forgotten." Chenoa looked around the camp at the faces of her family, her people, her heart. These were the people who had welcomed her home, who had helped her remember her true name, who had risked themselves to protect her from those who would force her back into a life that felt like death. "Where would I go?" she asked. "North," Desba said. "Into the mountains where the mining camps are. There are Apache working there. Young men separated from their families. Young women married to traders and trappers. They hunger for the old stories, the old songs. They need someone to remind them who they are. And beyond that," her grandmother added, "there are the hidden schools, places where Apache children learn to read and write in their own language, where the ceremonies are still performed, where the medicine ways are passed down properly. You could teach there, learn there, help build something that will last. Genoa felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders like a blanket woven from starlight and tears. She was 15 years old, barely begun in her own journey back to herself, and they were asking her to become a teacher, a leader, a bridge between worlds. But as she looked into their faces, she saw not burden, but gift. They were offering her a purpose larger than hiding, a destiny larger than survival. They were asking her to become what she had been born to be, not just Apache, but a keeper of Apache wisdom, a guardian of Apache futures. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Fear is wisdom when it teaches caution," Nalnish said. "But it becomes poison when it prevents growth. You have been given gifts, child. Now you must decide how to use them." As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and shadow, Genoa made her choice. She would leave at sunset, guided by stars and ancestors, carrying with her everything she had learned and everything she hoped to become. But first, there was something she needed to do. Genoa walked alone to the circle of stones as the sun touched the mountains, painting the ancient symbols in light and shadow. Each carving seemed to pulse with its own inner fire, spirals of journey, handprints of belonging, creatures that bridged the worlds of earth and spirit. She knelt in the center of the circle, just as she had 4 days ago when she first awakened to her true self. But now she was not the confused, frightened girl fleeing the mission school. She was Apache, she was home, and she was choosing her own path forward. From her medicine bundle, she drew the sacred objects her grandmother had given her: the turquoise spiral, the eagle feather, the corn pollen blessed by generations of prayers. She arranged them carefully on the red earth, creating a small altar to the spirits who had guided her journey. "Grandmother spirits," she whispered in Apache, her voice carrying across the desert like smoke from a sacred fire. "Thank you for calling me home. Thank you for helping me remember who I am. Now I ask for your blessing on the path ahead." The wind rose as she spoke, carrying the scent of sage and rain-washed earth. In its voice, she heard the whispers of all who had come before, the grandmothers who had hidden their children in these mountains, the grandfathers who had carved prayers into stone, the countless generations who had refused to let their people disappear. As twilight deepened, her family came to say goodbye. Each brought a gift for her journey: a water gourd blessed with safe travel prayers, a blanket woven with protective patterns, a knife with a handle carved from sacred wood, dried food that would sustain her on the long path ahead. Her grandmother was the last to approach, carrying a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. "This belonged to your mother," she said, pressing it into Genoa's hands. "And to her mother before her. It is yours now." Inside was a medicine pouch more elaborate than any Genoa had seen, decorated with turquoise and shells, containing herbs and stones and objects of power that spoke of a healing lineage stretching back to the beginning of memory. "I don't know how to be a medicine woman," Genoa whispered. "You will learn," her grandmother replied. "As your mother learned, as I learned, as all the women of our line have learned. The medicine chooses its keeper, not the other way around." They held each other as the first stars appeared, and Genoa felt the weight of generations settling into her bones. She was no longer just herself. She was the carrier of songs and stories, the keeper of knowledge that must not be lost, the bridge between the world that was dying and the world that must be born. "Remember," her grandmother whispered as they parted, "you are not leaving home. You are carrying home with you, spreading it wherever you go. Every person you teach, every story you tell, every song you sing. These are the seeds of our survival." Genoa walked north under a sky scattered with stars, her feet finding paths her ancestors had walked for countless generations. Behind her, the circle of stone stood eternal and patient, a doorway between worlds that would always be open to those who knew how to call it home. The mountains rose before her like sleeping giants, their peaks touching clouds that seemed to hold the dreams of her people. Somewhere in those hidden valleys were the lost ones, the scattered children, the young people hungry for the knowledge she carried. She would find them, teach them, help them remember. Because home was not a place you stayed. It was a gift you carried, a fire you tended, a seed you planted wherever the spirits led you. And Genoa, daughter of the desert, keeper of ancient wisdom, teacher of forgotten songs, would make sure that fire never died. Days later, when Sergeant Morrison returned with reinforcements to search the camp again, he found only the circle of stones standing empty under the endless sky. The Apache band had moved on, following the ancient patterns of survival that had kept them free for countless generations. But in the mountains, in the mining camps, in the hidden schools where children learned to read the sky and speak to the spirits, stories began to spread of a young woman who carried the old knowledge, who could teach the lost ones to remember their true names, who proved that some things could never be taken away because they lived not in places, but in hearts. The wind still carries her name across the mesas, still whispers her stories to anyone brave enough to listen, because the circle never truly ends, and those who answer its call become part of something larger than themselves, part of the endless journey home.